there was something very instructive there. And that is that as soon as archaeoastronomy was mentioned, the first reaction was, oh my God, what are we in for? And that, in fact, is something that I first became aware of a couple of years ago. Two things actually happened about the same time in late 2003. The first was that I read a very interesting article. Some of you might have read it, by Jed Buchwald, who's a professor of history at the California Institute of Technology. The article first caught my attention. I attended the California Institute of Technology, and I actually have a degree in history from there. And this is a school, I also have a degree in physics. And there's a lot more people with degrees in physics from Caltech than there are people with degrees in history. In fact, I think they probably give a history degree out once every 3 or 4 years. When I was there, being a history major in addition to a physics major was actually quite nice, because I would go to the student faculty parties. And amazingly, that year there was another student who was also studying history. So it would be 2 of us, and then maybe 15 faculty and staff members. So that was the kind of environment. So when I see something from a professor of history at Caltech, it catches my attention. And this particular article was about Egypt, which also caught my attention. Having traveled there a number of times and have been interested in Egypt for a long time. And his article was about what happened in France in the early 1800s when artifacts started coming back from Egypt after the Napoleonic invasion. Basically how the intellectuals, the scientific intellectuals of the time, viewed those artifacts and interpreted those artifacts. And around the same time, I was invited by Richard Wilkinson to present a paper on archaeoastronomy, on pretty much any topic of archaeoastronomy at the RC conference in Tucson in 2004. And so all that got me thinking, and I kind of for the first time went out and looked at the academic information available on archaeoastronomy in Egypt, and I found that it was really, really lacking. Almost nothing is published, nothing reputable is published or shows up at conferences on archaeoastronomy in ancient Egypt. And so I really started thinking, why is this? What's going on here? What's the problem? It doesn't seem like it's a problem at all with other branches of archaeology. Let's see if I can make all this work. Pretty picture. Certainly, most people are aware that Mesopotamian and Babylonian archaeology is full of studies of the stars and how the Babylonians and the Mesopotamians interpreted them and recorded them. Hindu and Indian archaeology studies stars. Obviously, Neolithic Europe, it's a big subject of study. The Mayans had a well-developed astronomy, which is studied. American Indians, for the last probably 50 years, archaeoastronomy has become a reputable area of study amongst archaeologists. Polynesians, and in fact, just about any ancient culture that we've studied, it is fair game for specialists to ask questions about archaeoastronomy. If you're an Egyptologist and you do that, your career is at risk. In fact, when I was speaking at RC, I was told there were certain words I wasn't supposed to use. I couldn't say precession, for instance, because if I said that in front of people, they'd walk out or be shocked. I didn't really understand it, because I'm used to physics and astronomy conferences, and it just doesn't work that way. But I'm afraid that in Egyptology, if you offend the wrong person, it's like, that's it. You don't get to go on the right digs anymore, and you might as well change your career. So I consider why this is a problem. It doesn't seem like it's a problem with other archaeologists outside of Egyptology. And I really came up with 5 things which I think are at issue. First is the lack of completely unambiguous artifactual evidence. There isn't a lot of material that shows that there was a well-developed culture of astronomy amongst the ancient Egyptians. There's the failure of astronomers to understand archaeology, and related to that is the failure of astronomers to assess their findings in other contexts. In particular, there's other evidence besides astronomical evidence, and astronomers aren't very good at looking at that other information. And this is probably the most serious problem, and I think that's kind of what we heard here at the beginning, is that a real Egyptologist, a reputable Egyptologist, really doesn't want to be associated with a lot of the garbage that's out there, and that the public perceives as astronomy in ancient Egypt. And finally, and I'll talk a little bit later about this, but I think there's a long-standing kind of bad blood between Egyptologists and astronomers or physical scientists in general. So let me talk about these. First, artifactual evidence. It's true, there isn't a lot of stuff. I guess the question is, how important is that? Yeah. We talk about ancient cultures. We talk about the Mayans as an ancient culture. We talk about Polynesians sometimes as an ancient culture. But ancient is really ancient when you look at Egypt. So the question is, how much total material has actually survived till now? It seems like a lot. We have all these monuments, and we have things in stone, and we have papyrus, but how much is that really, and how much does it really reflect Egyptian society? And I think that realistically what we have now is a very, very small cross-section of Egyptian society that's come down to us actually as artifacts. Certainly the stuff that they were writing in stone was intended for the public audience. It was material that they wanted to last forever. It was very biased towards royalty and the aristocracy. Material that they wrote on paper, I would guess that the barest fraction of everything they ever wrote down has lasted to this day. So I'm not really sure that a lack of artifactual evidence really is that important. And particularly important is that what I call astronomy, I'm an astronomer, I talk about astronomy, and I talk about ancient astronomy, but of course, what they were actually practicing in Egypt at that time, today we probably would call astrology. So they weren't really studying the stars in any modern scientific sense. They were studying it in some religious or spiritual sense. Whose job is it to do that work? Presumably something like a priest. And how do priests keep their power? They keep their power by keeping secrets. So it's hardly surprising that if the stars were being used in a spiritual way for divination, or even if they were able to predict things, another word you're not supposed to say, but if they were able to predict things, it's not surprising that they didn't write down the fact that they could do this or how they did it. Those things would tend to stay secrets. Of course, there actually is some artifactual evidence. We have astronomical ceilings. For instance, there's a number of astronomical ceilings, and in some cases those are detailed enough and accurate enough that we can identify specific stars, specific rise times, and actually recover something like technical data from them. So we know that they were looking at the stars, they were recording things, they were studying things. In addition to ceilings, there are also, was that first a ceiling? That might have been, I'm not sure if that's a ceiling or if that was the inside of a coffin. But inside coffins, of course, also you found star charts and recordings of risings and settings of stars. So there was artifactual evidence. This is actually a carving from the Temple of Horus in Edfu, and it has a inscription associated with it that describes how to use stars for actually determining an orientation. So we do have a little bit of technical information. Of course, this would be more like what a surveyor would use or a temple builder. So presumably those guys didn't worry about keeping secrets as much as say, a priest. Archaeologists and astronomers look at science differently. Physics is what an astronomer practices. Social science is what an archaeologist practices. Physicists or social scientists speak a different language. They have a different way of doing science. Archaeology sometimes fools physicists into thinking that it's a hard science. It looks like a hard science sometimes. If you watch the way archaeologists work in the field, they have fancy instruments sometimes, or they use isotopic dating, or they use ground-penetrating radar. They take very careful observations. It looks a lot like the kind of laboratory science that physicists are used to. But really, it isn't that at all. An archaeologist is a social scientist who's trying to understand the culture. He's using artifacts to try to understand the culture. It's an observational science, completely different than a kind of experimental science that a physicist practices. The way I think of it, or come to think of it, is that archaeologists use very little data, really insufficient data, to draw really big conclusions about culture. That's the accepted way of doing things. Astronomers take huge amounts of data. They usually have abundant experimental data. And all that's just to come to one tiny little conclusion about how one little thing works. Very different way of thinking. This was driven home to me a couple of weeks ago when I read an article in the last issue of Science magazine about glassmaking in Egypt. Basically, the evidence that was used, the hard evidence, the artifactual evidence, consisted of a couple of glass molds with a bit of old glass in them and a kiln. And from that evidence, the author extrapolated essentially an entire network of glass trading around the Mediterranean thousands of years ago. Paths by which the glass moved in different cultures and how it was traded and what kind of markets there were. All of that from pretty much finding a couple of ingots of glass in one location in Egypt. Well, as a physicist, that is, my attitude was, wow, this is an awful lot of conclusion, an awful lot of speculation for very little evidence. But that's what you have to do, because in archaeology you don't have the information and you don't have the ability to do experiments. But I don't think most physicists quite understand it. And finally, astronomers have a habit of over-analyzing things. Jim and I were talking before the meeting, and I think he was a little bit guilty of overanalyzing. Of course, he admitted that he was overanalyzing, and he recognized that he was doing that. So, but I think sometimes people don't realize they're doing that. This of course, is Stonehenge, to give a good example. You know, I think almost everybody would agree that some of the stones at Stonehenge line up with certain astronomical events, obvious ones like solstices. But some people have taken this to the extreme. I mean, if you draw enough lines on this thing, you can prove anything. And I'm sure you've all seen it with the pyramids. The lines that have been drawn on pictures of the pyramids proving anything and everything. Same idea. And sometimes that analysis is honest over-analysis. It's a mistake, but it's done honestly. Of course, in other cases, I'm not so sure. And then there's this issue of Egyptologists being concerned with being associated with pseudoscience, with UFOs, with astrology, all kinds of crazy stuff. This is a really serious problem, and I think it's probably the primary reason that Egyptologists shy away from astronomy. And why does this happen? Well, I think it's something that's been going on for a long time. There's been a Western fascination with Egypt, probably going back 2,000 years or longer, but certainly in the last 200 or 250 years, Egypt has really risen to the attention of Europeans and after that Americans. So there's this fascination with ancient Egypt, the romance of it, for a long time the belief that that was the birthplace of all civilization, mankind developed there. This was a romantic belief in Europe 200 years ago. So the question is, how do you go about quantifying that? And the way I did that was with our old friend Google. And I did a search on the archaeoastronomy of different cultures. And it's pretty obvious here that Egypt, over there on the right, is dominating all of the websites. The numbers up here, here's the percentage, 48% of all archaeoastronomy websites are focused on ancient Egypt. And of course, as I've already explained, there's very little evidence of archaeoastronomy. All these other cultures, the Mayans and the Babylonians, there's much more tangible evidence of their astronomy. But here I am speaking in front of the Egyptian Study Society. I don't know if there's a Babylonian Study Society here in Denver or a Mayan Study Society. I don't think so, because there is this fascination with Egypt. Interestingly enough, these absolute numbers, which are the number of pages, the percentages are really similar to I presented a similar chart to this at RC in 2004. So the percentages are fairly similar. The numbers have all gone up by about 3.5 times. So in a year and a half, there's 3.5 times more sites total devoted to archaeoastronomy. One other thing that's changed here is the Mayan wedge has gotten a little bit bigger, which I attribute to the fact that the Mayan Great Cycle is ending on their calendar in 2012. And now there's thousands of websites out there describing the great cataclysms and how the world's going to end and so forth. So I think that's boosting the Mayan bit of the pie here. But everything else stayed pretty much the same, with Egypt around half. I did a very specific search on the Dendera Zodiac, which I'll talk about some more in a few minutes. We got 6,760 hits on the internet on that one item. Of those sites, I looked at a sampling of them. 5% of them are travel sites. So the companies that are running tours to Luxor and up and down the Nile, about 5% of them were their sites. About 5% of them were scientific sites. About half of those were on EDU domains. And these were pretty reasonable pages. About 20% were just sort of mindless references. You know, somebody mentioned that they went on vacation and they saw the Dendera Zodiac at the Louvre, but no other information. And sadly, the remaining 70% were astrological sites, UFO sites, various sorts of pseudoscience, very bizarre alternate chronologies, you name it. Absolutely nothing there that any reputable Egyptologist remotely wants to be associated with. Unfortunately, that's where the public is getting their information about Egypt. That, and of course, books being written by the people who are running that 70% of the websites. So, gee, didn't I hear this guy mention earlier? So this is the junk that the people are reading. You go down to Borders, that's what you're going to find on the shelves. Another friend of all of us here. Both of these works here, works using the term loosely. For instance, take Jane Sellers. I don't know how many people are familiar with Jane Sellers, but she's done some really interesting work on early mythology, the very early mythology in Egypt, a lot of which is tied to astronomical concepts. She's quoted in their works. If you go to their websites, in fact, they say things like, Egyptologists now accept the fact that the Sphinx is 12,500 years old. and then they say her name after a sentence like that. They do the same thing in their books. Well, obviously, she has to go out and defend herself. You go out on the web and you can find websites where she's putting up defense of her own position. Because, of course, if she goes to a conference now, everyone's going to look at her like maybe she's in on things with these folks. So, not a good situation. And honestly, I don't think you can blame an Egyptologist for wanting to stay away from that kind of association. You know, these guys, I don't know how many people have read Hancock or Bobal. I mean, they're very, very good at making what sounds like a really convincing case. And I don't think most of the public actually has the capacity or capability to really see what they're saying, to see how foolish this material is. Of course, these are the guys who are putting out most of the books. Most people aren't going out and getting archaeological journals and reading what people really think. And then finally, there's this sort of maybe issue of whether there's any bad blood at all between Egyptologists and between astronomers. And this takes me back to the Bookwall article that I mentioned earlier on. And the story that he tells is a very interesting story. And it goes back to the invasion of Egypt by Napoleon. Now, Napoleon actually invaded Egypt because he believed, as his savants had taught him, that this was the birthplace of all civilization. And he basically felt that it was his job to go back and restore civilization, that it had become degenerate and it was no longer civilized. And so he took it upon himself to civilize Egypt. And of course, he took his savants, engineers, and scientists with him on this expedition. So these people, well-educated, intellectual people mostly from France, now were traveling in Europe, or excuse me, traveling in Egypt for the first time. This is the Dendera Zodiac. The artist vivant Denon was with Napoleon when he was in Egypt, and he observed this zodiac, and he drew it. And when he got back to Paris, he published a book with the image in it, which was just captivated European society. This is the image he drew. Immediately what happened when this was published was that scientists of the time, I have a list here, but Fourier, Laplace, Biot, Dalton, Young, all these physicists, chemists, mathematicians of the time said, wow, this is a star chart. This is a planisphere. And in fact, there are numerous recognizable modern zodiacal symbols in here. So it's quite easy to determine where the zodiac is, and the point of the summer crossing is marked on this. And it deviates from where it should be. Basically, this looks like a map that's wrong. And so what happened was the savants said, well, let's analyze this completely scientifically. These were people who had deep suspicion of analyzing things that were written down. They didn't trust written documents because they felt it took too much interpretation. Now, I'm sure everybody here has seen examples of what Egyptian writing looked like, and in a sense, it's true. It is a little weird to interpret sometimes. But they felt that images were absolute, that you could interpret them very clearly and very scientifically. And so what they did was they said, well, why is it that the solstice doesn't match where the constellations are? And the obvious answer there would be that you had precession. That is the wobble of the Earth's axis that takes it through a huge cycle, causing the eclipse to go through, to rotate. So that was what they assumed. And by doing that, they felt they could date this. And they dated it to various times, the earliest being about 4,000 years ago, and the oldest being something like 14,000 years ago. Meanwhile, the people who had a better understanding of what Egyptian culture was like, even then, were looking at the temple in Dendera and saying, wow, this seems Greco-Roman. This doesn't seem like something that was 14,000 years old. On top of that, you had a lot of politics going on at the time. If you say something's 14,000 years old, well, that's older than the Bible allowed for. So you had conflict with religions. And there was a lot of complex stuff going on in France around those times. So there's all this stuff is going on. But basically, we get a fight started between the people who are interpreting Egyptian culture through their writings and through their art and through their artifacts, and then these scientists who felt that you should throw all that stuff out and just take this planisphere and use that. In 1807, this image was published. It's a very beautiful image. This is kind of nice because it also shows, I think this is probably Isis over here. And there's these nice columns of hieroglyphs. So this was all part of the ceiling with the zodiac on it. This was published in the Description de l'Egypte, a multiple volume set that, again, once it was published, rekindled interest in Europe in Egyptian culture. This is another huge seller. It actually had an introduction by Fourier, who obliquely, at that point it was very difficult to talk about things being really old because there was an agreement between Napoleon and the church, so they weren't going to say things were too old. But he very obliquely went back to his idea that this was thousands of years old. Of course, in 1822, Champollion deciphered hieroglyphs. Suddenly those things weren't so mysterious anymore. In particular, there are cartouches down here, and what he was able to read was the word autokrator, the Greek word for dictator. Well, finding that written in hieroglyphs pretty much sealed that this was, in fact, some Greco-Roman artifact. All the same, some of the scientists wouldn't give up. Biot in particular spent another 20 years arguing that this really was an accurate star map. And he came up with all kinds of rationalizations for that. He said, well, people were remembering an important time. It commemorated something important that happened, that they remembered. And 4,000 years later, or 3,000 years later, they were able to recreate that on a map on the ceiling. Kind of stretching it a little. So there was this bitter fight between Biot, Champollion, Fourier. Even the scientists, Biot and Fourier, they had different opinions on it, and they fought each other. So these guys were all going to conferences, they were talking, they were giving lectures, they were giving public lectures, they were publishing their own material, and I really think that some of that attitude is remembered to this day, and that, in fact, Egyptologists, I know Egyptologists are more likely to remember this than astronomers. I doubt that there's any astronomers who know this story. They don't care, but somehow I think some bit of it has come down in the Egyptological community. But interesting afterward to this story, this was the image that people were using for their talks and for their ideas. This beautiful image that was painted by a group of engineers and artists for the description. And of course, the dating was finally conclusively determined by the contents of the cartouche down here. So a few years later, even though the argument was kind of going on, everybody else had accepted Champollion's more recent chronology. Champollion mounted his own expedition to Egypt because he wanted to see this. What actually had happened was that the center part here, this was removed from the ceiling of the temple. In fact, it was rather brutally removed. When the engineers couldn't remove it, they dynamited it out. So they hauled this bit of it here back to the Louvre, where you can still see it today. But this other stuff here all remained on the ceiling of the temple. So Champollion went to look at this. And does anybody know what he found when he got there? The cartouches were empty. There were no hieroglyphs in them. The people who painted this saw those empty cartouches and decided that was just unaesthetic. So they copied stuff from other places in the area and filled them in. And this was the material, this was the evidence that was being used for 20 years. Actually, an empty cartouche has a meaning. There was an interregnum period between the reign of Cleopatra's father and the formation of the co-regency in 42. And during that period, all these carvings, there was no ruler. And so carvings made during that time, the cartouches were left empty. So, in fact, the empty cartouche ultimately allowed this to be dated very, very precisely, because that was the only time you find the empty cartouches. But all of the arguments were really based on bad data to begin with. So, kind of an amazing story. In fact, this was what they were basing their dating on. This was what Champollion was basing his dating, which turned out to be pretty close to correct, but nothing in there. If you go to Dendera, where you can still see this, they're empty. I think all of these things I've been talking about kind of are really saying that if anybody's to blame for the problem, it's mostly the scientists, the physical scientists, the astronomers, the physicists. As an astronomer, I should point out that actually none of the scientists who were involved that I was talking about here were actually astronomers. They were mathematicians, chemists, physicists, and in fact, some of the astronomy that they published was actually bad astronomy, wrong astronomy. They made assumptions about how the heliacal rising of Sirius would change with precession, and in fact, the distance between the heliacal rising and the solstice doesn't really change very much because Sirius isn't on the ecliptic. And they sort of failed to recognize that. So they actually got some of the astronomy wrong too. But I don't think it matters. I think it's still what it really comes down to is a big mistrust on the part of archaeologists, Egyptologists, to physical scientists in general, to people meddling, really meddlers from the outside who are not in their community and should know better, shouldn't be involved. I didn't mention earlier, but of course, archaeologists do have fruitful collaborations with physical scientists, and Egyptologists have fruitful collaborations also with physical scientists. If you go to a dig, it's common to find geologists who are putting things in context, dating stone, botanists who are looking at pollen and seeds to determine where things came from or how old things are, hydrologists maybe finding where water used to be and how water patterns run. These kinds of collaborations actually do happen, so it's not like Egyptologists won't work with other kinds of scientists. In fact, they'll even collaborate with astronomers if it is research which is driven by the archaeologist. That is, the archaeologist has something he's trying to understand, and he brings in some specialist who can help him interpret the data. So in that sense, an astronomer can be useful for maybe dating a heliacal rising, or maybe identifying which stars might have been involved in some architectural alignment. That's like a very safe way for an Egyptologist to use an astronomer. I think they get upset when astronomers start coming in with their own research. And that's where you get problems. And that's kind of what happened back in the Napoleonic times, was these guys just came in with their own ideas and said this is the way it is, and they didn't look at any of the other evidence that was out there. They just basically didn't consider it. And that happens because astronomers and other scientists, physical scientists, aren't archaeologists. But realistically, archaeologists also are not astronomers. And I think that they overlook astronomy in ancient Egyptian culture at their own peril. I think there is stuff there that they're not seeing because they're really not looking. And so the question is, how can that be changed? And to me, the way it's changed is we talk about it, we get it out in the open, that there really is reputable archaeoastronomy. We're not all Hancock. And the way to start is by recognizing that the information is probably not going to be obvious. We haven't found tablets that say, this is how we go out and measure a zenith crossing of a star, or whatever. There really isn't anything that we've found that says how astronomy might have been practiced. So the question to ask is, what might the Egyptians have known? So we make a list. I mean, there's some things we can be pretty sure. We're pretty sure that the Egyptians did not know about black holes. We're pretty sure they did not know about dark matter. We'll leave those things off the list. But there is stuff that they had the capacity to know. Maybe they knew it, maybe they didn't know it. But they could have known it. They had a long time to look at the sky. A very, very long time. They were a very rich society, socially stratified. They had people whose whole job could be, for their whole life, do nothing but look at the sky. Certainly that happened in other cultures. So what could they have known? And I've kind of broken these things into a few different categories. First is cosmological things. Did they know the shape of the Earth? Did they know about the orientation, about the position of equinoxes and solstices, sort of the universe around them? Well, to what degree did they know things? They must have noticed some cyclic phenomenon. I suspect that they noticed that the moon went through a cycle once a month, for instance. Of course, there's other less obvious cyclic phenomena. And then there's non-cyclic phenomena. Giant comets coming through, or meteors coming down, things that you can't predict. So these are all things that they might have made observations of. So, for instance, in cosmology, did they understand the celestial sphere? That is, did they see the sky as a bowl over their heads or a sphere around them in some way? Did they recognize the celestial equator, that part of the sky that's actually over the Earth's equator? Did they recognize the celestial pole? Did they know that they could use a pole star? Of course, their culture was so long-lasting that there were times when there was no pole star, or not a very good pole star, but there were also times when there were pole stars. Were they aware of the ecliptic? Presumably they knew there was a path that the sun and the moon and that the planets followed. The pole of the ecliptic, which is, you kind of rotate around and imagine where the ecliptic circles that axis. Were they aware of that concept? What did they know of constellations and asterisms? Obviously we know a few of the constellations that they recognized. How did they interpret cardinal directions? I've actually heard it said, seen it written by a supposedly reputable researcher, that the Egyptians had no concept, I believe, of east and west. They only recognized north and south. I'm not buying it. Did they know the Earth was spherical? What shape did they think the Earth was? And then we have cyclic phenomena. Of course, I picked these pictures here. This is obviously a reference to the fact that the chamber at Abu Simbel is astronomically aligned, and I don't think that there's very much debate about that. So how did they perceive the equinoxes and solstices? How good were they at predicting? Lunar eclipses. Lunar eclipses are kind of one of those funny things. They are cyclic, but if you don't look close enough, you might not realize it. So did they see lunar eclipses as being cyclic? Did they see them as being non-cyclic? How did they interpret them? I don't know that anybody's even recorded any information or found any documentary, tangible information that they've even recorded one, but they must have. I mean, they happen very often. Solar eclipses is even more impressive. Every culture except the Egyptians has recorded solar eclipses. They're a very dramatic event, and to most cultures, they're very frightening event. The motion of the inferior planets, so that's the planets, that's Venus and Mercury, how they move. They move differently than the superior planets that are outside the Earth's orbit. So how do they explain the motions of the planets? We have no information that I know of that document how the Egyptians viewed like retrograde motion. If you watch Mars over the course of time, it would go one direction in the sky and turn around and go another direction. It took European scientists a very, very long time to come up with a model to explain that. There were some really bad models that almost explained it before then, but presumably the Egyptians certainly were aware that the planets were moving in this way. Heliacal risings and settings. I don't think there's much debate anymore that the heliacal rising of Sirius was a sort of a fundamental part of their calendar. A chronal rising and settings, kind of actually the other side of the sky in the morning or in the evening. Meteor showers, certainly cyclic. We recognize them as cyclic now. It's hard to believe that they didn't notice that at least a few of the major showers were coming around at the same time every year, since they knew what a year was. Comets. There are cyclic comets, like Halley's Comet, which come around relatively often, every 76 years in the case of Halley's. For a civilization as long-lasting as Egypt, it's hard to believe they didn't notice something that repeated on a 76-year cycle, but there's no documentation of it. And maybe a little more controversial, but did they understand the precession of the pole and the precession of the equinoxes? Related phenomena, but they might not have recognized that they were related. Personally, I don't see how they couldn't have noticed that these effects. You can observe them very easily in 100 or 150 years of observation, and they had a lot longer than that. But it's not documented, so it's kind of not accepted. Lunar standstills, that's the way that the moon moves north and south over a long period. We are pretty sure that some American Indians were able to recognize that. At Chaco Canyon, there's evidence that they have made markers marking the northernmost and southernmost points that the moon takes. Hard to believe, again, that this wouldn't have been noticed by the Egyptians over several thousand years of observation. And finally, there's non-cyclic phenomena. Add comets again, because some comets may have a very, very long period and may only show up. So every now and then one of these great comets will show up, like when Hale-Bopp came around. And certainly we know that most cultures perceive comets as ominous harbingers of doom. One would assume that if something like that appeared in the sky, that they would have taken notice of it, but we don't know. Fireballs, which of course, as Richard mentioned, I monitor here from the museum. Very impressive sometimes, huge things sailing across the sky, fire falling off them. They had to have noticed these. Big bolides will happen once every few years. And in some cases they may even lead to meteorite impacts. There are examples of ancient cultures using iron, making iron tools when they did not have iron technology, by using iron for meteorites, which is really the only source of almost pure iron if you don't have smelting technology. Meteor storms, once a century or so, there'll be a huge meteor storm where you might have 30 or 40,000 or 100,000 meteors an hour. Literally, the sky is falling. Supernovas, a new star appears in the sky. Again, every few centuries that's going to happen, and these can be stars that are bright enough to be seen during the daytime and will persist for weeks or a few months. Auroras, this image up here was taken right here in Colorado a couple of years ago. Not something that most of us here in Colorado see very often. Certainly not something seen in Egypt very often. But in fact, a couple times a century, there will be an active enough sun that auroras like that will appear in the sky. I can tell you that when I saw that, I've seen auroras in the north, but when I walked outside from central Colorado and saw that in the dark sky, I was amazed. I mean, I know what it is. I know where it comes from. But I was still amazed by what I saw. I mean, it brings out something inside when you see something like that. My first thought was, what did the Indians who lived here 200 years ago think when something like that happened? It must have had huge mystical significance. And I can't believe that something like that appearing in the sky over Egypt wouldn't similarly have some kind of major significance to that culture. So, where do we look for this stuff? If they didn't write it down, we don't think they wrote it down. I've never seen a record of an eclipse in any writings. Jim was telling me that he's not aware of any records like that. So where do we look if they didn't write down specifically the sun went dark on this date or under this ruler? Well, calendars, certainly. Clocks, certainly. These are very uncontroversial. I think every Egyptologist accepts the fact that calendars and clocks were star-driven elements. Somebody was looking at least closely enough at the stars to be able to put together calendars and clocks. Architectural alignments, I guess it depends on what you're looking at. There may be some controversy in some cases, but I don't think most people would have a problem accepting the fact that something like identifying the cardinal directions to lay the pyramids down may have been done by surveyors using the stars as a tool. Then some things that I've never seen any reference to, and I don't know if anybody's really looked. What about navigational methods? How did the Egyptians navigate? Certainly, it's pretty obvious that you can use the stars for compass directions. Maybe a little less obvious is that you can use it for latitude, but the extents of the Egyptian empire from north to south were very large. Certainly, traveling from north to south in Egypt, you would see a significant change in the position of the constellations, especially when you look north. Just like we see the North Star now rise higher or lower as you go north and south. That must have been very apparent traveling up and down the Nile. And of course, with just a little bit of imagination, it's not too hard to figure out that you can use that to tell how far north and south you are. So even if you don't see something explicitly written about the motion of the stars in the sky as you travel, finding it in some reference somewhere to just navigation would be a place to look. And then you might look for an astrological reference. Certainly in Mayan writings, we know that if one king died and it was time for another king to take over, the installation of that king would be delayed until something was happening. For instance, if Venus was in opposition, that would be a bad sign. So you wouldn't want to put a king in then. So they would actually delay ceremonies and time their ceremonies based upon where things were in the sky. Just because we don't know, we don't have it written down that the Egyptians did that, we might be able to detect something like that somewhere else. Look at the date a war started. Look at the date a king was installed. Look at the date that a temple was dedicated or built. Those things may relate to some kind of astronomical positioning, probably of the planets, because that's usually how astrology works. There might be references to prophetic events. So they don't mention eclipses or supernovas specifically, but again, if you're looking for these kinds of events, when you interpret other data, maybe you can see something there that you wouldn't have if your mind was closed to the view. What I was told, what I read, I talk with Egyptologists when I read their work, is that the reason that we don't have the evidence, and the reason that we don't even need to be looking, is because the Egyptians were not interested in the sky. Many, many people have told me that. Basically, something about their culture made them uninterested in what was going on in the sky. Personally, and this is very unscientific, but I don't believe that. because I look at all the cultures that we've had here since the birth of civilization, since before the birth of civilization. You look at where people have lived. Where have people lived? They've lived on top of mountains. They've lived in Arctic ice. They've lived on islands. They've lived in the middle of jungles. We're a very adaptable species. We've lived in all those places. We've survived by hunting, by fishing, by gathering, by farming. We've made tools out of whatever was at hand: iron, bone, wood, stone. All of these things are different between cultures. Cultures existed in isolation. Cultures interchanged information with each other. But what every one of those cultures had in common, the one thing that everybody's had in common, is the sky. Everywhere and pretty much every wind, people had the same sky over their heads. For half of the day, it is nature overhead. How is it even remotely possible that that was not a critical part of the development of Egyptian culture? I can't know for sure whether it was or wasn't, but I would say that it's something that we should be looking at, that Egyptologists should be looking at, and in the end, I guess the question is, if really, truthfully, the Egyptians did not care about the sky, then why is that? Because that is a really profound question. They would be the only culture that apparently just ignored the sky. So I think that if you're an Egyptologist, you do not have a choice. You either have to look for references to astronomy and accept that it probably was there, or explain what it was that was so different about the Egyptians that they actually ignored it, and it wasn't a major part of their lives. Thank you. If there are any questions,